This week's lecture is a little different. We're going to be talking about something that you could potentially do in the future as an advanced undergrad student or as a grad student, or if you decide to move on into a scientific career. And I'm going to talk to you about how you write a scientific paper. Now, when you're first starting out, the first thing you really have to figure out is this paper even worth writing? And that means that you have to do some research. And when you're working on this paper, the most important question that you ever answer is the so what question, because the paper can be super interesting to you. It can be something that you think is really important, but if you don't let your audience know that it's important, if you don't answer the question of why should they care, no one's going to be interested in what you have to say. So when you're trying to figure out if the paper is worth writing, the first thing you really need to do is do a literature review. You need to start doing a deep dive into all the related literature, starting kind of broadly and narrowing down into the focus that you want to work on. So to begin, you would need a research question. And that research question has to be something you can answer. It's not something that you just, think of that you have no possible way of ever finding out the answer to. It has to be something that you can feasibly research and do. This means that there is data that will allow you to answer it. Either data that already exists in the form of secondhand data or data that you can acquire yourself. Now, when you have that research question, you need to be able to state that question and then state that question and its answer as a single sentence. So if your research question is, are there political variations in COVID vaccine uptake by age cohort? You'd need to be able to state and answer that question in one sentence. So we would answer that as saying, when examining whether there are political variations in COVID vaccine uptake by age cohort, we found that older Republicans were much less likely to be vaccinated than older Democrats. And that comes from my paper on COVID vaccinations and age. Now, when we start with our paper, we often have a lot of questions or a very nuanced, complex question. And I'm going to encourage you to simplify. Instead of using one paper to answer a lot of questions, consider breaking those questions up into multiple papers and simplify the question so that you can really give a deep dive into the answer. Once you have your paper constructed, you then need to make sure that you are writing it for the journal that you plan to send it to. Every journal has their own format, their own audience, and their own guidelines, and you need to really know if your journal of choice is someplace that would be interested in your paper, because you want your paper to be a good fit. This means that it is something that the journal is interested in, they publish on it, the people who read it are experts on those types of topics, and that you send it there, you have a good chance of it being at least reviewed. Because if you send a paper to a journal that it's not a good fit for, you've wasted your time. Now, the first thing really you should do once you get the research question and you've done the lit review, before you start any real writing, is that you should lay out an outline. And your outline should look basically like this. You start with a statement of purpose. This is your introduction, and this is your presentation of the problem. This should be grabbing my attention, should be holding the audience's attention, making them want to learn more. This is where you first introduce that so what question. Next, you move into a thorough review of the literature, but make sure that it's only the relevant literature. If it doesn't move your paper forward, if it is not directly related to what you're talking about, it does not belong in your paper. That means you have to get rid of it. You also should not be including any I statements. There should not be any opinions here. This should just be facts. The research shows X, and that's it. Okay. Then we move into the data and methods. The data section begins with a thorough description of where you got your data from, and then your methods section goes through a thorough description of what your variables are and how you measured them. Then you move into the analysis of the data, and this is where you talk about what you actually found. Again, we don't speculate here, and we don't offer interpretations. We just say what the data actually is. Finally, we move into the discussion and the conclusion section. Now, this is where you can speculate as to why you found what you did. This is where you should say that, oh, I found this, and I was expecting to find this, and here's why we found this. This is also where you talk about the limitations of your study, And you end by saying, despite these limitations, this study is valid for these reasons. Now, throughout the drafting process, the first thing you should do is create all your tables and figures first. That means you're starting with the analysis, because if you know what you found, it's a lot easier to craft the rest of the paper. Once that is done, then you actually move into that outline, and you should always plan on writing a paper multiple times. So as you're writing it, you should name each draft in this format: file name, title, author name, and then the date. So for example, one of the drafts of one of my most recent published papers is Implicit Resentment, my last name, and then the day that I actually last worked on it. This tells you what the most up-to-date draft is, and it means that your co-authors, if you have any, aren't confused as to what the most recent draft is. It also means that you know that you're working out of a single draft. So I would work on this on my part. I would put my name and date, then I would send it to the next person. They would change it to the new date and their name, and so on and so forth, and we're always working out of just one document. When you're writing your introduction, you need to do your best to grab your audience's attention. This means tell a story. Get their attention immediately. Make them want to know more. As you are working on a paper, always think about it as an hourglass. It's very broad at the top, it narrows down, and then it broadens back out. And your introduction should be similar, where you'll move from a very general description of the problem to a very specific problem. By the third paragraph, it should be very clear what you are doing in your paper. We shouldn't have to wait till the end of the introduction to know what you're actually planning to do. The first paragraph, very general. The second one, a little bit more specific. By the end of the second or moving into the third, I should know exactly what your research project is. As you're writing the introduction, you should be targeting the journal's specific audience using terms and theories that are familiar to them. You should also be identifying gaps in the knowledge. You say things like, while we know X about this topic, we don't know Y about this topic. This helps people know that you've identified what we know and what we don't know. And you'll end your introduction with a roadmap. And this should not be a surprise to anyone reading the paper. They should be able to read that roadmap and know exactly where you're going throughout the whole paper. It would say something like, we begin with relevant literature, then a discussion of the data and the methods before analyzing and presenting findings, and finally discussing what these findings mean. When you're writing a lit review, you need to be thorough. That means you need to find every relevant literature about your topic, but not superfluous. This means you don't tell me stuff that is not related to what you are talking about. So if you're looking at the effects of smoking on the human body, telling me about alcohol on the human body is not relevant or related, and it is superfluous and is not information. It could be interesting information, but it's not important to the work you are currently doing. So don't add in any unnecessary details. When you're writing a lit review, you always use present tense. So anytime you quote someone, you say things in the present tense. So you would say, we know that penicillin treats a wide variety of diseases. You do not use past tense in a lit review. Always end your lit review by stating what your hypotheses or research questions are. Then you move into the data and methods section. Now, typically, this is the very first thing that is ever written. We start with describing the data. So who's in the study, how's the data collected, when was it collected, how are things measured, and so forth. The methods section should include subheadings. So you would have a subheading for the dependent variable, the independent variables, the control variables, as well as any ancillary or statistical procedures or coding that was done. You're going to write in a clear enough way that any non-technical reader can pick this up and actually understand what you said. You are writing to just the average person on the street. This means avoid jargon as much as possible, because by writing in a clear, concise, and open way, you actually help with people being able to replicate your study. When you use a lot of jargon, people may not be able to replicate your study because they don't know exactly what you meant. Now, in the data and methods section, as well as anytime you discuss your own findings, you always use past tense. Okay? When you describe your own study, you refer to the work in the past tense. You say, we tested, not we test. Okay? We tested a new antibiotic for sexually transmitted diseases. After writing the data and methods, we then move into the results, and this is often the second part of the paper that is written. And again, as I just mentioned, it is in past tense. The results section is always just the facts, just like the lit review. You do not offer opinions or conjecture or interpretations here. You just tell me the findings. So, for example, compared to Democrats, Republicans who were 65 and older had 92% fewer odds of being vaccinated for COVID-19. There's no conjecture there. There is no speculation as to why they had fewer odds. It is just, this is what we found. And that comes from my paper on COVID vaccination and the older adults in America. Now, after you write the results section, most people move into the discussion and conclusion section. The first paragraph of the discussion section should tell people what you did. It should start with, we tested whether vaccination rates were related to age. Okay? And it should answer then your research question and hypothesis. And we found that political affiliation was a strong predictor of vaccination status. You should then discuss the implications of your findings. What does it mean? Why does it matter? You should be conservative in this. This means you should be very understated in your findings. Don't overstate them. Don't say something that is just grandizing or hyperbole. You want to say your findings, but you want to downplay them. Discuss why you found or didn't find what you did or thought you would. So, for example, we did not expect to find any differences between vaccination rates of older adults by political party affiliation. Okay? The reason that we did not expect that is that research has shown that older adults listen to their doctors. They don't listen to politics. If their doctors tell them they need something, a procedure, a vaccine, or whatever it is, they get that. Okay? There's no difference between, for instance, Republicans and Democrats with the flu shot before the pandemic. However, something changed in the pandemic, so we had to speculate why that was. Then you focus on the strengths of your study throughout. So throughout the discussion, you say, we're the first study to do this, and we found this, and this is important because. As you move into the last paragraph of the discussion and the paragraph before the conclusion, you list the limitations of the study. You say, one of our limitations is this, and then you say something along the lines of future research should look at this to understand these relationships. Your last paragraph or paragraphs is your conclusion. In this, you re-emphasize why your study is valid, and it almost always begins with, despite these limitations, our study is important because, and you tell us why. You, throughout this conclusion section, talk about how your study can be used in a practical manner. So now, let's just take a look into the future and talk about publishing a peer-reviewed paper. As I said before, know your audience. So before you submit a paper to a journal, know the style of the journal and know the format of the journal, and make sure that whatever you're submitting actually fits. So for instance, don't submit a paper on osmosis to the Journal of Optometry. They're not going to care, and they're just going to reject your paper, and you're going to be down a few days or longer because it's going to get rejected, and you've basically wasted your time. Now, you can find out exactly the formats and styles that they like on the instructions for authors page of the journal's website. Now, I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm going to. You need to make sure you carefully proofread your paper before sending it to anybody else. The other people on your paper, whether it's your professor or your co-authors, are not there to fix grammatical errors. They are there to improve the overall argument of the paper. They are there to improve the content, the flow, to make sure that it is the best version of the paper it can be, so don't waste their time. And this needs to be done especially before submission. You are responsible for mastering the basics of grammar. Now, there are plenty of word processors like Microsoft Word that have become standard writing tools. So you should not have very many typos or spelling errors to begin with, but Microsoft Word doesn't always catch when you use the wrong version of a word in a sentence. So you should also look into using grammar checking websites like Grammarly. Keep in mind that the first draft is never your last draft, ever. Most people's first drafts are terrible. There's an article called Shitty First Drafts by Anne Lamott, where she talks about how everything she writes is garbage. Even Stephen King wrote a little short story that is how he writes garbage the first time he writes. And he says in that you write with your door closed and then rewrite with it open. And what this means is you write your first draft with your own mental thoughts and processes, and then you come back to it and edit it with your readership in mind. Okay? You should make a serious effort at editing, rewriting, and fine-tuning before you give this manuscript to anyone else to read. And if you need to take a step away to do this, like if you write it out and you're just having a hard time seeing if a paper is good or not, you need to step away and then come back to it and start again. When you start a writing project, make an outline of your major headings. List the key ideas to be covered under each heading and organize your thinking into these outlines. Okay? You are not writing complete grammatical elegant sentences in these outlines. You are basically separating it down so that you know what each paragraph in the paper is supposed to cover. And that is what we're going to talk about on the next slide. But to begin, separate out the three tasks of figuring out what you want to say, planning the order of your arguments, and crafting the exact language that you want to express your ideas. Now, most students can write reasonable sentences that are pretty good or passable at least, but a lot of students have a real difficulty organizing those sentences into effective paragraphs. Paragraphs should start with a topic sentence that sets the stage for everything that follows in that paragraph. This topic sentence needs to be short and direct. Less is more. Build the paragraph from the ideas introduced in the topic sentence and make it flow from sentence to sentence until the next paragraph. Whenever you are citing someone, you need to focus on the ideas, not the authors. So unless the person who reported a result is an important part of the statement you're making, literature citations should be parenthetical. So some studies have shown that political conservatism is a robust predictor of pandemic lifestyles. Hill et al. 2022. That is how it should be written. You should not be writing most things as Hill et al. 2022 has shown that political conservatism is a robust predictor of pandemic lifestyles. The focus is always on the ideas. You're not just saying researcher A did this, researcher B did this, researcher C did this. You're saying this is what we know, cite, cite, cite. We also know this, cite, 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 but what we don't know is this. And that's where you start building your research question. Now, this might not seem intuitive to most people, but almost every person who writes a scientific paper writes the introduction last. This is because it is really difficult to write a good introduction without the context of the rest of the paper. The problem with writing it first is that it's going to need substantial changes by the time you finish the rest of the paper. If you have to write it first because your mind just works that way, resist the urge to make it like perfect, because it's going to get rewritten and it's not going to be the same as what you wrote. Now, this also applies to conclusions and abstracts. These elements of the paper are sometimes the only thing most people will read, so these need to be the most well-written parts of the paper, and they really need to convey the points you're trying to give across. Your paper should also flow. You are much more likely to influence your readers if your paper is well written. This means that this paper will flow and resonate with the reader, meaning that every single part of your paper makes sense, every part builds off of the other, and it is clearly presented. Find papers that you feel do this well, and as you write, try and copy and mimic that structure. Try and write in the similar fashion as they do. And with practice, you'll start identifying what makes papers work well, and you can start implementing those strategies into your own work. So let's stop here.